Okay.
Should I bring the sweat bottle out?
Shall we actually get started and stop bantering randomly? Yes.
I guess.
Alrighty.
Hi, folks. Welcome to Anthrocon, our first writing panel. The beer. Yay.
The beer?
Year. No.
You definitely said beer.
I said year, you butt. Don't you do that. I'm TJ. Hi. Hi.
Hi. Alright. I'm Significant Otter.
And I'm Sparf. I think. I hope.
It's too early to know.
It is, in fact, too early. I have to check my badges. No, yeah, I'm Sparf. I'm not Cam Hirosaki, accidentally. That happens sometimes, particularly in October. So,
There's this right there.
there it is, I'll tell you later. So, we're here to tell you about the words and on the pages and things you can do getting started. So, he has notes.
And we're going to ignore them.
So one thing that I really like to start out with in a beginning writing panel, or for a lot of people who want to get into writing and who might be a little bit intimidated, who might see all the creatives with so much talent, so much ability that are out there that you have to like put your stories next to. Writing is a skill. It is not an innate God-given talent. It's like practicing piano. It takes work to get good. If you hum a really pretty tune in your head one day, will you just be able to sit down at a piano and put out a masterpiece? No, you won't. Because you need to refine your craft, you need to build up the technical abilities, and you need to work hard to the point where you can actually take that tune, refine it with the understanding that you now have of music, and turn it into the beautiful symphony that you had in your head at the start. Some people make it look really easy. I have a friend who writes upwards of 3,000 to 5,000 words a day. It's insane. But what he didn't start out doing that. He started out struggling to get 300 to 500 words a day. And when he was in college, he read Stephen King's On Writing and saw what Stephen King did with his writing every day, and he was like, I can do that too. So he started pumping out the words. He just dedicatedly pushed through every single struggling day of difficult writing where the words just wouldn't come, and he kept on putting down the words, and suddenly 1,000 words came easier, 1,500 words came easier, and he was writing 3,000 to 5,000 words a day. It's all about hard work. Your technique gets better, your habits form, and you start to write more effective fiction that comes out easier and easier the more that you put your pencil to the grindstone, to mix metaphors, and start putting words on the page. So things that I'd really like to go over in this panel are setting goals, finishing stories, and how to improve based off of what you've already written. So what do you guys do for goals when you start looking towards the future? Both when you first started writing and nowadays when you're trying to put out new work at where we've gotten to now.
You want to start or shall I?
Oh, you're next to it.
Works. Well, when I first started writing, it was really writing by the seat of my pants. I got an idea and I'd start. And the extent of goals I had when I first started writing was I want to write X words a day or X words a week. Actually, what I started to do to really try to motivate myself is I started doing a small game of sorts, where if, with another writer friend of mine, where if one of us didn't reach whatever word count we set for ourselves, the other person added an element to their story. So that's something that helped motivate me, because if I want to write my story, not have to add in a random butterfly here, I'm going to write my story, make sure I get my words on paper. Now, as far as goals go, it's short. My long-term goals are usually, I want to write for this anthology, I have this story idea I want to work on, or two, I want to edit for one that closes here in like 2 weeks. That's going to be fun. But it's still in the extra, that is long term, but it's 30 days from now, it's longer. Short term, it's I still want to write 1,000 words a day. I want to sit down for this hour and block out time. And sometimes for folks, it's easier to block out time instead of going by words. Sometimes it takes me an hour to write 100 words. Other times, it takes me an hour to write 1,000 words. It really depends on my day, my mood, how the words are flowing. It just varies.
When I started writing, I had a knack for it in school. Like, I got good marks from creative writing teachers. Woo. And I kind of put that down, and then I would get ideas, and I discovered fan fiction at an appropriate age, and I wrote a few things. I never wrote very much of it, but it was sort of a wedge in the door. But I didn't really set goals so much as I just was like, this story needs to be finished at some point. And like now as part of a writing group, which is a monthly meeting, I seldom get things done because I'm actually really sort of slow at writing. I can write a lot of words. I can sit and I can dump between 1,000 and 5,000 words in a few hours onto paper. But I will be no closer to finishing the story than I was when I started, because it's what software developers call scope creep happens, and I'm bad about that. So I try to, now when I set a goal, I will narrow it down to something achievable. Whether or not that meets an overall goal, that's it's something I can work toward. And while I'm rambling a little bit, I want to tell you, and this goes for basically all the writing panels at any convention ever. I go with Chuck Wendig's philosophy on writing advice, which is writing advice is bull. It's BS. BS fertilizes. Nothing any of us says up here is sacrosanct and an absolute, except the Oxford comma, and if you don't use it, you're a heathen.
I'm a heathen.
Yeah. Anytime I edit for you, I'm just going to put it in. It's just going to happen. And then I'm going to get back a manuscript with nothing but stat. You take what works for you. It's just about the same in any creative endeavor. Whatever techniques or tricks or goal settings or anything you find, if it doesn't seem like it works for you, if you try it, it doesn't work, you're not obligated to stick to it. Like we talk about Stephen King, how he like write every day, and that sort of has become a mantra that people will tell you, to get better, you have to write every day. And I'm here to tell you that no, you don't if it doesn't work for you. There is a sci-fi author named Mary Robinette Kowal who writes once a week. Now, she writes for 6 hours. She blocks off that, but that is her writing day. So her method is completely different from the conventional wisdom, but she makes it work for her.
Right, absolutely. The core idea, though, is trying to find what works for you and turning it into a habit. I find that that's a really important thing for getting better. Because when you don't let something become a habit, you can fall into the trap of starting something and then letting it go to the wayside as it starts to get harder to continue through. And then you just never get around to finishing it. That's a problem I had, and you had mentioned that with like early writing. That's a big problem that I had when I started writing in like high school and early college. I would put out like 4 to 5 pages of half-baked fiction that I really wanted to finish, but it would just sort of fall by the wayside as that idea became difficult, and I actually had to resolve plots, deal with character arcs, and do the harder mechanical parts of the stories, and I got excited about other things. It takes a long time to put words on a page, and after a little bit, it gets difficult. There are always going to be in every story difficult parts that are hard to put out, that feel like you're forcing words from yourself. But my first goals, as Spar said, weren't words every day or anything like that. It was get a story and finish it. Take that story and post it online. Don't look at the reviews and comments. Then finish another story and put that online. And then I wanted to like start getting some comments and some votes and stuff on my stories, and that really helped me, like taking that kind of process of an actual achievement-oriented goal rather than a numeric number of words goal, which that's what I do right now. Right now it's a number, or it's a time goal, like TJ was talking about, where every single morning before work I get up and I write for an hour, exhausted. No matter how late I stayed up the night before, I will just sit in front of the computer, don't do anything but have Scrivener open and put out maybe 50 words if I'm really exhausted and I stayed up way later than I should have. But it's that time, and that turns into a habit. You had a question?
Yeah, I did. For my young writer here, when she sits down to write, do you suggest perhaps an outline before you actually reduce the thoughts to the first written paragraph, an outline on what you're trying to achieve?
I think Spark's thing on writing advice being whatever works for you.
Your mileage may vary.
Here.
Yeah, there's a sort of a false dichotomy in writing circles that is, you're either a plotter, meaning you outline everything, or you're a pantser and you just write without any plan. And most people sort of weave between the two as necessary. If you're having trouble getting started, or you get into the middle of a story you've started and you can't get around a plot problem, then an outline, I find going back and doing an outline when I get stuck is often helpful. But it really is, whatever works for you and helps you get it finished and focused. Because some people do great with outlines. Some people do better in get it on the page and then edit later and fix all the story structure stuff later. Some people can kind of see the structure that way in their head, and some people need it on a grid and on an outline like that. So I would say, yeah, I mean, if it works, give it. If you don't know if it works, give it a try. If it doesn't work or you don't find it very helpful, you can always move on to other techniques or just putting words down.
I know for me, when I first started writing, I was a pantser. My first actually few published stories were written on the fly. I had the idea and I ran with it. Now it's slowly transitioned to where I outline more now. I know I remember having a story that I started pantsing, and then as Barf said, I got stuck. I knew where I wanted the story to go, but I didn't know how it got there. So I started doing my outline backwards. So here's where the story ends. How did they get there? Well, they did this. How did they get there? Well, this happened. And I just backwards until I found out where I was. But it's still, even to this day, it changes. I had a story recently. I outlined the heck out of it before I even wrote it. And I had another idea for the same anthology that I'm like, no, this is simple enough that I can just pants and go.
That's very similar to what I do with starting from the end. I'm the consummate outliner. Everything that happens in my stories, I outline start to finish, and then I have a cool idea, and instead of writing that down first, or putting it on the page, instead I run to my outline. I'm like, wait a second. If I put this here, what changes in the outline? How does the outline work around this? It's always, for me, outline first. But again, that's just me. It's really about what works for you. Every approach is valid. My approach with hard outlining every single plot point and making sure that things work in the structural format that I intend them to is a good way to do it. And also just running with it and seeing what happens, and then at the end refining it into the structures that you want it to be is completely valid as well. You had a question? Okay. All right. So one thing that I find is very difficult as a newer writer is motivating yourself to finish something. What did you guys do when you were starting out to motivate yourself to finish stories? How did you get through that difficulty and go past the hurdle where you just wanted to go do anything else, and what the thought of the story made your stomach clench because you're like, I can't get back to that. I'm just gonna go watch TV or do whatever.
For the most part, I never really had that issue.
You're lucky.
Yeah, I'll own that. For the most part, it's usually, as long as I knew what my story was, going from the beginning to the end, that first time through, isn't always impossible. Now, granted, there's still days where I'm like, I don't want to write this scene, or it's specifically a scene that I'm having trouble with. but if I have, it's really just a matter of self-discipline. If I know I need to sit down for an hour and work, it's just that constant repetition of, no, I need to do this. This is my time for writing. I have to do this. So that's, for me, the actual getting the words on the page is kind of the thing I more tried to focus on.
So as someone who is primarily kind of a pantser and who outlines in reverse when I hit a snag, what would happen to me would be I would be writing something, and I would sit down, I would start writing it, and just putting words on the page. And then I'd have to stop for the night, I'd have to go to work or something. And I'd be standing at work, and I'd be like, oh, and then this would happen. Oh, and then this would happen. Oh, and then this would happen. And then I'm like, oh, well, now I know the story. I don't feel like writing it down. That's work. So what broke me out of it was, honestly, I wrote an email to a writing podcast. I was like, hey, do you have any tips on this? And the response was, you just have to finish it. You just have to force yourself to do it.
You remember that?
Yeah.
I missed that podcast.
I missed that podcast a lot too. But it was just that moment of, oh, I knew that, but hearing it from someone, quote unquote, in authority made it crystallize for me, and I was able to sit down and focus. And it also helped me that I stopped. I forced myself to stop thinking about my story during other things when I couldn't write anything down, because eventually I got out of the habit of not finishing stories, so it doesn't matter now. But at the time, as a crutch, just forcing myself to think of other things, or keep a notebook and write down my story ideas.
Let me chime in on this quickly, but we had two questions in order. One thing, there were two things here that really made this difficult for me. One was that I was a compulsive editor. I would write things, and I would keep on going back. Whenever I continued my story, I would start from the beginning of the story, read through it, and then change so many things, and then go and back and edit it because it just didn't feel right. And I would make so little progress on my stories, and every time it would become more and more of a slog because it was becoming more and more monotonous and draining for me. One thing that can really help if you find yourself in that kind of scenario is to force yourself to just keep on writing. If you have an idea that makes the first part of the story not work, and you think it's a really good idea, keep on writing as if that had happened. Then you can go back and change it at the end. It's really important that you just finish that story and you keep on going. And if you are the type like I am, who will just continuously change the wording of the last two paragraphs of the story, or go over it and think, oh, well, what if I change this? And then take that out and put that back in, and you find yourself not making progress. Just force yourself never to change any word that is put down on the page. You only add new words, and you only continue because there's time for editing at the end. One other thing that I really had helped me was setting up an environment that was easy to work in. Some way that I always knew to write, where I would, I lived in Baltimore for a while, and I would walk to work and back, and I would walk to a coffee shop in the morning and sit down in the coffee shop, and all I did in that coffee shop was write. And that kind of, your brain works in a weird way where your environment can tell you what time it is for something. If you have trouble sleeping, for example, it might be because you use your phone a lot before you sleep, and your brain thinks that this is time to do stuff. And then if you stop using your phone in bed before you sleep, and you just go to bed and you start sleeping, your brain learns that when you get into bed, that is time to sleep. It's the same thing for writing, where if you set up an environment, like I don't sit anywhere else other than my home computer when I'm writing, because my computer setup is too convenient, and I don't have a good coffee shop near me anymore. But I will sit down and I put on Rainy Mood, the rainymood.com rain sounds, and then I put on a certain playlist that I have, and I switch over to Scrivener and open it in the no interruptions mode, so nothing else plays. I've got none of my notifying apps on. Telegram isn't up, Messenger isn't up, none of that, and it sets a specific environment that I know to write in, and that really helps me. So you had a question?
Yeah, I wanted to know when you're like progressing in a story, and you know to progress the story, a character needs to die. Like, how do you deal with that? Because you know you're thinking about this character much longer than they've existed, right? And you're kind of like, now this character has to die. How do you kind of deal with that as a situation? You know, like they're a part of you, kind of, or a version of like that person. You created a piece of you, and then now you have to kill it in order for the story to progress.
It's hard to kill your babies.
Is that a
Oh.
weird question? I don't know.
Oh no, it's
No,
it's
it's
a solid question too.
Yeah.
I mean, I think back to, I remember a story I wrote for for Inhuman Acts, this second volume. I got really dark, but then it gets noir, so it's supposed to. It's one of those things where I got to the end and I'm like, I feel like an asshole. Congratulations, you did it.
I know it's really, sorry.
So go ahead.
It was really common for me when I was when I started writing, and for a lot of people that I see starting writing, to create characters that they want to protect, that are reflections of themselves, and that makes it so that they don't want anything bad to happen to the characters, and that's really a common thing. And it can be hard to kind of divorce yourself from the characters or let things fall in the way. And even though it can be important, the stakes, drama, and tension are things that come out of negative character traits or bad things happening to characters. And so it's always a difficult step, kind of like learning to distance yourself.
Or characters making bad choices that you, the author, and we, the reader, know is a bad choice, but are right for the character in the moment. Like, and it leads to things like I write a not insignificant amount of horror, and am a big fan of horror as a genre. And one thing I notice about some people who consume media in the horror genre is they will apply their knowledge to what's the character. So that's where you get the people like, well, I wouldn't go down that dark basement when the lights are. I mean, yeah, you would, because the circuit breaker's down there. You're going to go down there. So when you're writing that kind of stuff, you don't want them to go down there, because you know what you put down there.
Yeah.
And it's something that there's no real way to overcome other than to just do it. And if you need to, I mean, it's a thing you can practice. It's a thing you can work on. You know, if you really need to like see how someone else does it, you know, pick any sort of grim dark fantasy and just try to ignore any of the troublesome tropes in some of it. And like look at George R.R. Martin, like it's a meme that, you know, oh, his characters are all dead. And yeah, he kills characters when they need to die, sometimes when they don't need to die for the purpose. He will kill them off because that's his thing. And if you look at sort of how he does it on the page, then the technique can kind of help you puzzle through it yourself. But the only other thing I can say is to try to keep some degree of separation there. The character doesn't die because the character never lived. You've created a character, they have to die for the story. If you really feel bad about that, you post that story online or whatever, you can always write another story with that character. You can do your own personal fan fiction for your own work and just keep it in a folder, and that's where that character lives now. They live in these stories, in this folder, in this shard of reality, or however you want to think about it.
I'm having Undertale flashbacks. So we had another, or did you have something to say?
Well, it's more, I mean, there's also two other things I could think of in regards to that. Is one, if you're feeling this bad about your character dying, first of all, is it really necessary for the plot? Is there another avenue you can take for your story to progress without this character dying? The other thing is kind of similar to what Sparf was saying, but different. Is yes, your character is dead, but they're also not, because there are other characters who are impacted by that. How do they move on? And that is also now becoming part of the plot. So just because the character actively is not in your story, they're still there passively. They still carry on in other characters and how they react to that and how they act now after that fact.
Also, if you feel this much about your character dying, so will the readers, and it is great schadenfreude to make readers feel bad about things happening in your story. It feels very good. So go ahead, you had a question.
So going back to what you said earlier, being stuck on scenes, and I know the mantra of this panel will be do what works for you, but I just wanted to hear your experiences. If you're ever stuck on a scene, have you ever just skipped it temporarily and worked on the next scene first?
Yes, absolutely.
Sometimes sometimes I just need to power through it because I don't like skipping scenes. I don't like trying to stitch them together. That story, sometimes I don't want to stitch it together because no, let me just keep going and I'll slog through it one word at a time and eventually I'll get there.
Yeah, I'm very chronologically oriented with how I process things and how I move through things one scene at a time. So it's difficult for me, but there are times when I've just skipped a scene. And sometimes when I do that, I go back and I say, wait a second, the scene that was really difficult for me to write, it just wasn't really working anyway, and I can use just like a few scattered blocks of exposition to toss in there. But sometimes it is necessary anyway, and after writing the rest of the story, it's easier to go back and finish the scene. I know a few writers who just ignore chronology altogether and just say these are the scenes that I'm most excited about, and they start from them and then work back and then connect everything together. It's again what works for you, but these people do write these ways, and it's not wrong to go ahead and skip a scene if it's difficult or it's just not coming to you, and then get back to it later. Having like the end of the story done and having a mostly completed work helps so much in motivation towards going back and either editing or adding in missing scenes.
Yeah, I'm probably the exception at the table. If it's a short story, I tend to write it chronologically. And I will sort of power through a difficult scene because we're talking about most of my short stories, most of mine come in like at just over 10 or 11,000 words, which is fairly high. I have a hard time often doing like the 5,000-6,000 word thing. If it's a longer work than that, and I have a to-be novella stack of stories that have been rejected from places that are pretty long, and I'm like, well, there's enough here that I could turn them into a novella. So I have a stack. Once it starts getting longer, I stick everything in Scrivener and I divide it scene by scene, and then I will use Scrivener's folder structure as a rough outline, and I will just go in here. I'm like, oh, I want to write this scene, and I don't know where it's going to go, so I'll just leave it as a floating piece of text, and then I can shove it into the appropriate chapter later. So I absolutely say, yeah, if you need to skip a scene, great, do it. If you feel like you have to power through it one word at a time, do that.
I think it would be important to talk for a little bit here about, I know we've got a writing groups panel, but just the basics of finding critique and accepting criticism. I think that's a really important step for most new writers. So how did you guys first find your critiques or find beta readers or anything? Because that is, I find that such a hard thing to do as a new writer who doesn't really have any connections with other writers, who wants to post things online, but they have trouble finding other people to actually read over their work and make sure that things work well.
One resource I can point out, especially for beginning writers, is the Free Writers Guild. It's a place that does have a lot of resources available that people are there who are able and willing to do beta reads for you. I know I've got a number of first stories there. I've actually made a bunch of great friends through there, waiting for their forms to come back in some form or fashion. But they still have a Slack and a Telegram. Both are available. That's a place I could definitely recommend going to as an option to try to find them.
Outside of that, in the long ago and the before time, I found critique largely by now the equivalent. I'll just give you the equivalent now of I found furry writers like on Twitter, and I followed them, and I interacted with them, and most of us, or we'll interact somewhat. If you get to know people who are, you don't want to. I'll caveat this with you. You can get feedback from people. When you get feedback, if you ask for feedback from writers, you're going to get very different feedback than if you ask it of a friend. Unless that friend is a writer or a fairly special kind of friend to have and that you should cherish. You should cherish all your friends. Because writers will give you story structure. Writers will give you, this didn't work and this didn't work. And I think you could do this, and I think you should consider changing this scene around, and what if this? And a lot of times what will happen is if it's not someone who is a writer or does a lot of structured critique of that kind, you'll end up with, yeah, it was great. Yeah. Which is nice. It's nice to have that warm fuzzy, but it really won't help your story get better. And there's always something that can be improved. I can pick the literary masters off the shelf. I mean, not even the dusty old ones, but like the modern literary masters. And I can go through and I'm like, well, I would this whole section I would edit differently. There's always room to improve, to change, to grow. It doesn't matter who you are. I mean, it really doesn't. There are furry writers who sell lots of books, and some of their books I will read them and I'll be like, huh, that's a choice. That's certainly a choice. But it's out there. It helps to have that kind of brain too, and also it helps to be willing to swap critique. The best way I've found to get people to give you critique is to offer to critique their stuff if they need it. Because then some people have sort of an actual mental checklist. Okay, I owe that person 3 beta reads now, and eventually it just becomes mush. Some people are just like, yeah, sure, you did 1 for me, I'll do the next 3 for you. It doesn't matter. If you're willing to reciprocate, you'll find better luck.
So I want to add on to that with the way that I first found beta reads was actually so you know how you get that wonderful validation when you get a comment on a story on SoFurry or Fur Affinity, and it's great, and how especially when you're a newer writer, you want to respond to everything. So if you leave comments on writers' stories consistently, if you read what they write and you leave comments when you read stories of theirs, they will get to know you and they will talk to you and you can talk to them, and oftentimes they'll go to your page and they'll read things that you wrote if they're interested. That is actually how I started finding my first critiques. I was on SoFurry and I would comment on stories that I liked, and I would talk about, in serial fiction, oh, this is interesting, I wonder what's going to happen with this, I think this is a cool thing that's coming up, I wonder if this is going to turn out from this. And they would respond, they would talk to me, and they read some of my stories, and I asked for a beta trade, and they accepted. It's really easy to get to know writers by commenting on their stories, because we all love when we get comments, and you will love when you get comments too. And it is a wonderful thing to have, and it's a great just way to get to know other people.
Real quick, I believe we had a question.
2 questions actually. She was first, and then over there.
So do you find it difficult, to beta, or if somebody betas for you and you guys have completely different writing styles, so then they suggest to do something a certain way and that's not how you write?
That's my favorite kind of feedback to get back, because they will point out the things that you might not be good at. A lot of my common beta readers who beta read my stuff often, I know what they're good at, and they help me shore up a lot of things that I'm not good at, and they help me improve in those areas. So it can be difficult because you can see something and be like, oh crap, I didn't realize that was a problem. I've had moments in a story where I on my like second beta read, someone pointed this out, and I was like, oh God, I sent this to another person. Wait, they didn't say anything about this, but this is totally right. Oh, I can't believe anyone else saw this. But still, I fix it and it works. And I know that they're able to help me with areas that I might not see and that I'm not personally as good with.
I mean, honestly, any sort of feedback you always get is, like we say, like we're talking about, right, this is, your mileage may vary.
Right.
I think back, going to Otter specifically, we have his style differs from mine.
Yeah.
I hate the way he does internal dialogue, not italicized. No, italicize that. But he's like, ignore that. I'm just like, okay, fine, yes. Do you. Makes me cringe, but no, to each their own. Really, I think he's wrong, but that's okay. It's my thought.
That's valid, but you're wrong and I hate you.
And as to echo their stuff is feedback is feedback. And if a piece of feedback is really not useful or you really disagree with it, nothing obligates you to take that feedback and apply it. You can make that, as long as you're making that decision on an informed basis and going, I see what you're going for, but that's not what I was trying to do, so then it'll guide you on changing so things are more clear. When you get into a situation where you're working with an editor for a thing like an anthology or something, even then, there's negotiation, because people tend to think of, as some people think of the editor of an anthology you're writing for as the hand of God on earth, and most of the time it's here are suggestions, and then you'll get it, and you'll have one you'll really disagree with, and you'll sit and you'll agonize over it, and then you'll talk to them and say, okay, I have an issue with this. I think I disagree with you here. Is there a way you see to keep this the same and make it work? And then it becomes a dialogue. You're always free to ask and push back and ask questions.
I had a friend recently who went through that exact scenario where they had submitted a story with a twist that they had foreshadowed, they built up to, and the editor was like, I'm not sure about this twist, could you just do something like this? And he's like, but that breaks my foreshadowing, it breaks the whole structure of the story. And he was really nervous that like the fact that this twist was so this was such a divisive opinion by the editor. The editor was fairly strongly opinionated about the twist that he would end up not actually staying in the anthology. But then the editor said, yeah, I understand that, and it's good, it's a really good story, good enough to include, so we can just change some things elsewhere, and that's fine. But it's always about differences of opinion. Suggestions that other people make aren't things that you have to change. They're suggestions. They are opinions of other people that should influence how you look at your story. Like, I might see something that I don't want to change, and like in a writing group, that someone might say something, I think that this could use work, and I'll be like, and then someone else says, I also think this could use work, and I'm like, okay, and then the third person says that, I'm like, okay, something's really wrong here, and I need to change it. But also, there might be the case where one person out of 5 says something about a component, and you're like, okay, I can see why they think that, but it doesn't really, the story, I think, is stronger with it for the other 4 out of 5 people who are likely to read it. Because there's a wide variety of people who will read the stories that you put out, and they're all going to have different opinions about things they like and they don't like. I often beta read for a friend of mine who includes a lot of framing stories, and I have I harbor a big distaste for framing stories in fiction. I do not like framing stories. I think that they're pointless. They often take away from the actual plot and structure, and they give away things. I don't like them. But they do them fine, and I let them know when I don't like the framing story, but they often rightly choose not to take my advice about it, and their stories work. But they choose the critique of mine that helps them, and they think makes their story better, and ignore the stuff that that they think is either difference of opinion or just the way I read things.
And sometimes a piece of feedback you get can just be wrong.
Yes.
A reader will miss something and they will comment on it. I got edits back, and I got a note. Why are you calling this character this name when we've only ever heard him called this other name before? Is this a problem? And I went back one page and found the full name given. I'm like, but no, it's there. Just responded to the comment. I was like, no, it's there. It's literally there. It's one page before, you just missed it. And I'm like, does it not stand out? Is it the way my sentences are structured? Because I tend to be a little, with my sentences, I am to do the inverse of Buck Turner, I am not a student of Hemingway. No.
But yeah, like things like that, you can often see comments where there are things that you wouldn't change. They aren't changes that you would make, but they kind of show a thing that are slight problems with your work elsewhere that caused that person to be like, wait, what's going on here? And you might say, okay, I did introduce this name, but maybe I need to make it more clear, or maybe I need to accent this slightly more so it's more obvious when I refer to it later. So it might not be that change or that problem, and they might be wrong about it, but oftentimes reader feedback, I mean, it's what readers will read in your story. They are a representation of the average reader once you put it online, and some people will think like they do. And the question isn't how to make all the changes that they suggest, but to how to adjust it so that they read it more smoothly and that sort of thing. And sometimes you can't please everyone, and your vision for the story doesn't match up with that.
And I want to move to the second part of what you said when you brought up this topic, and that is sort of how to accept criticism, because that's something it feels sometimes when you get feedback, it feels a little bit like someone is stabbing you with knives, because you're like, I thought it was good. How dare you? How dare you hurt me personally like this? And they're probably not trying to hurt you personally. They're trying to give you feedback that will be helpful. The trick there is be open to it. If you're the one giving it, I have an entire podcast episode on this. If you're the one giving feedback, be kind about it, because nobody needs to hear, I've got an eject button on this story. And then 3 pages later, you know that eject button I talked about? I'm licking it now. Like, nobody needs that critique, ever. And that makes you a douche. So don't do that. Just like, admittedly, I have had stories which have made me viscerally angry. And what I have done is I have written out all of my comments in the way I feel them, and then I take that same base file without comments, and I make new comments that are kind and suggest improvements. Because sometimes a story will make you angry because it has a framing device, or it lacks Oxford commas. Stuff like that. You know, like, there's really no reason to ever be cruel. You're not Gordon Ramsay. You're not Yahtzee Croshaw. You're not James Rolfe. That's not what you're there for. You're there to help, and they're there to help you if they're giving you critique. If you find someone consistently being mean or way too harsh in your view in the way they phrase their commentary, bring it up. Bring it up gently on a friendly basis. Say, hey, look, the way you phrase these things seems unnecessarily confrontational, and it makes it hard for me to really gauge what you're saying. Sometimes can we work on that? Some people won't, and then you don't ask for feedback from those people anymore. But that's probably my number one rule about feedback, is be willing to hear it. And if you're giving it, be kind.
I think TJ is a good first-person account.
So no, so when one of the first critiques I got through the guild was with Otter, and Otter is
It's one of my first critiques through the guild too.
was
So
was
that's where this is going.
very issue focused. Where the areas of opportunity were, all of the areas of opportunity. I was looking for it, and so I'm like, where are my issues? And he's like, issue. I'm like, okay, went through it. And then it was kind of funny because we did our, first day of RAR, we went over how to give a critique. And the first thing we hear is, give positive feedback to.
Well, what happened the first day of RAR,
What had happened
which is the regional anthropomorphic writing retreat. The first day, it's a like 6 day. It's fantastic, and you should all apply. But it's a 6-day retreat. It'll be in Texas. This was in Lake Tahoe when we were doing it, where you just go in a house with like 6 other writers, with Kyle Gold and Ryan Campbell as the instructors, and they talk through a bunch of writing stuff, and you do some intensive writing there and run critiques on stories. I gave the first critique of the event. I got up, I started just going through my comments on this story, and the instructors stopped me and said, "You need to rewrite this," and moved on to another person because I was being far too harsh. When I was writing, I had mostly gone back and forth with one other beta reader who I knew pretty well and I knew from middle school. And we were both writers, and we just tore each other's stories apart. We would redline the hell out of each story, and we would just tear into them, get them back, and make all the changes. And we knew that we liked each other's fiction. We knew that we respected each other's writing, and that made it okay. When I started beta reading for TJ, and I just tore apart everything that I found wrong with the story, he didn't know that I respected his story and that there were a lot of parts of it that I really liked and that I thought he was a good writer. He just saw the red lines everywhere in the fiction. And that is a really hard thing to see. You get no positive reinforcement and only think that this person thinks that your story is a pile of crap. It's very, very important to compliment sandwich, or to make sure that you put in the good aspects. One thing that really stayed with me from RAR, just a minor tidbit that I can throw in there, is anything that you didn't point out in your critique, any aspect of the story that wasn't something that you called out, was likely done pretty well. And those are things where you should make a list of the aspects of the story that you want to talk about. And then when you do that, and when you see which comments fall in what areas, take the other areas that you don't have as many comments in, or you have no comments in, and say nice things about those, and then put that into your critique. And then that's a great way to make sure that you pepper in nice words about these sorts of things. Okay, I know we had another question back there. Yes, sorry.
Oh, no problem. I just want to ask, I do quite a bit of writing on social media, and some of it is kind of lengthy and involved because I'm, refuting other people's arguments point by point. I know that doesn't count as fiction writing, but can the techniques you learn and develop there help your fiction?
Absolutely. Grammar, structure. You obviously won't get character development or world building or story structure, but any kind of writing is writing. You still get grammar tips. You learn to pace your writing and construct flow.
I got my smart paper in college in spinning BS. Also known as an English degree. So a lot of that is all of that was nonfiction writing, but still that sentence structure, the how to make an argument, how to explain something, I use that left and right in my fiction every day.
I would write papers for my MFA, and they would be, again, nonfiction. They'd be essays and papers on topics, and they would be, and I would get notes back from my professors, and they would say, you need to simplify your language because you're technically correct with the way this sentence is, but it doesn't need to be a paragraph long for one sentence. And I'm like, well, that's your problem. Sort of like when people tell me, well, I don't know what these words are, they're too big. I'm like, well, that's your problem. But really, that's feedback I either need to take or leave behind. And that's usable in fiction, that's usable in nonfiction, in general writing all over the place.
There are a lot of things that you can take in from other kinds of writing or other aspects of your life that apply to your fiction. In high school, I spent a ton of time, almost every evening, doing speech and debate. And I know that Sparf does theater stuff. And like those kinds of experiences were incredibly helpful in making sure that my writing sounded good, that it flowed well and had strong pacing. And those are still two of the stronger aspects of my writing, flow and pacing. And that came from how I did a lot of speech and debate. And there's a lot of different aspects of creativity and technique that comes from different places that can very helpfully impact your writing.
And unfortunately, with that, we are at time.
Right. So where can I find your stories?
You can find my stories in printed anthologies mostly from Fur Planet. I've got, let's see, a couple of volumes of Fang. So Fang 6, Fang 7, Roar 7, and Will of the Alpha Volume 1. And then there are some others that may or may not be available through Rabbit Valley. There's Trick or Treat Volume 2. I have a story in there. I don't have a lot of stuff online because, as I said before, I'm kind of slow. And so when I'm taking the time to write, most of the time it's toward a particular publication goal. So I don't have a whole lot of things up on any furry sites, really.
I'm fairly similar. A lot of my stuff is written in anthologies, Fang 7, 8, and 9 out here this year. You can also find my Leo Literary Award-winning story, The Promise, in Heat 15, 14, whatever the most recent one was.
I am in the most recent Fang that's coming out of this con. Is that 9?
Yes.
Fang 9. I'm also in the Arcana anthology, Dogs of War. Both of those are, it's Fur Planet, and yes, and Thurston Howell Pub for Arcana. I have an anthology that will be coming out relatively soon, Species Otters, which I edited. I don't have a story in it, but it's a fantastic group of authors. And you can find me online at Running Otter on Twitter, no spaces. All right. Thank you guys for paneling with me, and thank you all for listening.
Yes, take care.